We have the question that I have for all of you. Do you guys think there is a blue mirage? Do you guys think the Democrats are flying high because of polling that's not accurate? I think a lot of us are huffing big time copium and thinking the polls are largely going to be right. And that hasn't been true for a number of election cycles. So the question is, did the Dobbs decision change the game, or are these just polls that are way too optimistic and we're about to get wrecked? I think the Roe boost is real. Not sure if it'll be lasting. I think it's lasting, dude. I think it's lasting. I think it's something. I think the Roe v. Wade decision being overturned was the ultimate gift that Democrats needed, which is a real fucking thing to campaign for that drew a clear contrast between themselves and the right. Say what you will, but when you have a culture war issue where you're winning that allows you to avoid sticky economic questions, that is something that could unite the entire Democratic Party except for Henry Cuellar. The other thing is, Joe Biden did something. Joe Biden forgave student loans. And that is an actual economic benefit for millions of people. So, like, the combination of having a actual issue to contrast themselves against Republicans on, and Joe Biden did one thing, is that going to be enough to bring people back? God, I hope so. No, I do outreach here in North Texas, and shit is different. I think Biden did bare minimum to gain support, plus the Dobbs decisions equals just enough support to win. Gosh, Lex Braddock, I think that is, I hope you're right. I was at the Fetterman rally yesterday, huge turnout, and we're going to talk about that too. Is having left-wing candidates in states like Pennsylvania going to result in a big W? And, you know, obviously, how important is the weak candidates from the Republicans? And the Republicans nominated some really dog shit candidates, and pretty much every race they've got to win. So, like, they went with the Trumpy candidate. So is that going to make the difference? What's the predicted at? Let me take a look. So right now in the House, the Republicans are at 75 and Democrats are at 26. And that's been pretty much flat. It's narrowed a bit, but largely the Republicans have been big favorites to win the midterms. Although it's declined, the biggest predicted outcome is the Republican House and Democratic Senate. Republican House and Democratic Senate is what predicted is picking. And I think that's probably a safe pick, but that's disastrous. That would be disastrous for Joe Biden. He would do fucking nothing. He'd probably get impeached, to be honest with you. The rally was awesome. A lot of us say we keep our heads down because the Trumpers are crazy. Yeah, I should have went to that thing. I'm an idiot. Should have went to that. That's crazy to me that you could strip rights away from people and half of them don't care. Darkest timeline. Dems literally lose by single-digit margins in statewide elections, and people want to think Texas is red. It can be done, but we can't let centrist Dems run the show. Run actual leftists in the win. A progressive at least beats generic Republican here. I mean, I think that's possible. I think it depends on who it is. I don't think you could just generically run on left-wing politics and win. I don't think that's right. You need to have more than just policy lists. Republican House means laws, which is why I like John so much. I don't know about you. I've tried to remain optimistic, but not delusional. Optimistic, but not delusional. All right? Like, that's the position that I've tried to maintain. Okay? And I think, you know, I try to take care of business where I am, right? You know, I'm in Pennsylvania. I push for the candidates I like. You know, Summer Lee, John Fetterman were my people going into the primary. I want them both. Mike from PA just keeps getting the W's. It's all my, I mean, you could give me all the credit. Like, I did it. I did that. But in all seriousness, you know, the Democrats have performed and way better than we could have expected going into the midterm. I have to say, before the Inflation Reduction Act and before the student debt relief and before the Dobbs decision, I mean, the Democrats were heading toward a 2014, 2010, 1994 level shellacking. They were about to get utterly fucking destroyed. But three good things have bounced in favor of the Democrats, and gas prices have come down off of that big peak from the Ukrainian war. So that's four things. And maybe they're going to be able to motivate people. So that's the question. Do you think, even if it's okay for 22, I don't see this wave sustained for 24? I guess the question is, how crazy are the Republicans? How batshit crazy are the Republicans? And what are the Democrats offering? I mean, that's what it is. That's where it is. And I don't know, man. All right, so back to the polling stuff. The polling warning signs are flashing again. Democrats are polling well in exactly the places where surveys missed the most in 2020. And I think this is the thing, is a lot of people are mentally attached to 2008. For example, Nate Silver got 49 states right in 2008. That was a relatively large victory, and the polls were largely accurate. And for some reason, everybody started filleting the fuck out of Nate Silver because he got 49 states correct in basically a borderline landslide election. But he's been consistently terrible in almost every election since. And the polls have been getting worse and worse and worse. If people don't vote for Democrats after getting 10 to 20K loan forgiveness, I'm going to lose my mind. He got that rank up, but then he deranked. Now he's Nate Bronze. He's Nate Wood. Pretty sure they called the Trump victory in 2020. No, they called a Biden victory. But they didn't call shit. They don't call things. They just throw random percentages out. And they say, no matter what outcome happens, they were right. If they said Hillary Clinton had a 99% chance to win and Donald Trump won, they'd say they were right. So, like, it doesn't matter. It's meaningless. The polling warning signs are flashing again. All right, let's go. Ahead of the last presidential election, we created a website tracking the latest polls. Internally, we called it a polling diary. Despite a tough polling cycle, one feature proved to be particularly helpful. A table showing what would happen if the 2020 polls were as wrong as they were in 2016, when the pollsters systematically underestimated Donald J. Trump's strength against Hillary Clinton. The table proved eerily prescient. Here's what it looked like on election day in 2020, plus a new column with the final result. As you can see, the final results were a lot like the poll estimates, with 2016-like poll error. All right, so the United States as a whole, Biden was up 8 percentage points. Biden was up 8 percentage points. In fact, this is incredible. He was up 10 in Wisconsin. He lost Florida. He lost North Carolina. Jesus Christ. He got destroyed, right? So polling leader 8% Biden. He ended up only winning by 4. Wisconsin, he was up 10. He only ended up winning by less than 1, which is why, I'll be honest with you, chat, I'm not as confident about Mandela Barnes. I think we're huffing the copium on that one. I mean, obviously, we got to go for it. Like, duh, it's one of the few states you have a shot. But, I mean, Biden was up 10, barely won. I mean, why isn't anybody doing anything about the laptop? Where is Hunter? Where is Corn Pop? Yeah, that's the important issues. Michigan, the polls were off by 5. Nevada, the polls were off by 2 or by 4. Pennsylvania, the polls were off by 4. Arizona, the polls were off by Biden was up by 3. He barely squeaked it out, less than 1%. Florida, Biden was up by 2. He lost by 3. North Carolina, he was up 2. He lost by 1. That's 3. 5-3. Georgia, Biden winning Georgia is the shock of shocks. I don't know how he did that. And then Iowa or Ohio, Trump was barely up. He won by 8. 7-point polling error. 8-point polling error. Iowa, same difference. Texas, same difference. So on average, somewhere between 3 and 8% biased in favor of the Democrats in 2020. Yikes. Yikes. To be fair, the margin of error is usually plus or minus 3 to 4 points, but with Trump and embarrassed voters, it's more like 5 to 8. Dead Royals, you understand that what you're saying makes absolutely no statistical sense? And you are demonstrating an actual completely misapprehension of what margin of error means. So the problem with what you're saying is, if every single poll is off by 4, even though that's off in the margin of error, that's not what you would expect if the polling was accurate. You would expect some of them to be +4 in favor of Biden. An equal percentage of them would be +4 in favor of Biden and +4 in favor of Trump. If every single poll is favoring Biden, that's a systemic error. That means the polls are wrong, even if it was within the margin. Not only that, they were outside the margin in many cases. That is really bad. That means there is a systemic problem with the sampling. We created this poll error table for a reason. Early in 2020 cycle, we noticed that Joe Biden seemed to be outperforming Mrs. Clinton in the same place where the polls overestimated her 4 years earlier. That pattern didn't necessarily mean the polls would be wrong. It could have just reflected Mr. Biden's promised strength among white working class voters, for instance, but it was a warning sign. The warning sign is flashing again. Democratic Senate candidates are outrunning expectations in the same places where the polls overestimated Mr. Biden in 2020 and Mrs. Clinton in 2016. Wisconsin is a good example. On paper, the Republican Senator Ron Johnson ought to be favored to win re-election. The 538 Fundamentals Index, for instance, makes him a 2-point favorite. Instead, the polls have exceeded the wildest expectations of Democrats. The state's gold standard Marquette Law School survey even showed the Democrat Mandela Barnes leading Mr. Johnson by 7 percentage points. Yes, it is a correlated error. The question is if the errors in 2020 will be correlated to the 2022 errors. Well, they were correlated with 2016, so that's the issue. That's the issue. Is it possible that in addition to a sampling problem, the polls being off systemically could be a sign of mass Republican electioneering? I mean, are you using electioneering in the way that word what the definition of that word is? All of the Ohio statewide campaigns in 2018 saw polling that saw them smashing GOP, which obviously the opposite happened. Exactly. Most margins of error are a 95% margin of error, meaning 95% of the time the results should lie within those margins. Exactly. You got it. In this case, good for Wisconsin Democrats might be too good to be true. The state was ground zero for survey error in 2020 when pre-election polls proved too good to be true for Mr. Biden. In the end, the polls overestimated Mr. Biden by about 8 percentage points. Eerily enough, Mr. Barnes is faring better than expected by a similar margin. Wisconsin data is just one example of a broader pattern across the battlegrounds. Actually, Chad, I will explain it to you very clearly. There are more white, non-college educated voters than the polls, especially exit polls, show. The polls are whiter and less educated than the polls show. This has been true for a very long time. Now, in the past, white college educated and white non-college educated voters were pretty similar in their voting. Okay? But there's been a significant divergence between the two, which means that, and the people that are more likely to respond and answer polls and the people that are more likely to have phone numbers and keep the same phone number for a long period are older college educated white people. So older college educated white people are more likely to answer these polls, and college educated white people in general, especially college educated white women, are going significantly more toward the Democrats. Now, the question is, have the Biden administration arrested the decline among non-college educated whites, especially non-college educated white men? And it is true in 2020, Biden outperformed Hillary Clinton, who was diabolically terrible with white non-college educated men. If Marquette is doing their polls in Marquette, of course it's a statewide poll, Dempo Dan. What are you talking about? I got the secret sample formula, but I will only release it for $5 million. Wow. Cheap. The Wisconsin data is just one example of a broader pattern against the battlegrounds. The more of the polls overestimated Mr. Biden last time, the better Democrats seem to be doing relative to expectations. And conversely, Democrats are posting less impressive numbers in some of the states where the polls were fairly accurate, like Georgia. If you put this relationship on a chart, beware, my editors have permitted me to include somewhat challenging scatter parts on occasion. You see a consistent link between Democratic strength today and polling error 2 years ago. Democratic Senate candidates are outrunning expectations in the same places where the polls overestimated Mr. Biden. I gotta say, I'm convinced by this. I gotta say that I am very convinced by this information. Could someone who's intelligent give me a reason why I shouldn't be? Because I am very convinced by this, to be honest by you. I'll be honest. So what this means is that the Democrats are doing a lot worse in Pennsylvania and especially Wisconsin than we expect. So the Democrats losing the Senate is a lot more likely than we thought. The simple reason is if it was easy to correct for polls, the polls would never be wrong. They used to be more correct, numerical whistle, than they are now. Polls still move considerably after conditions on the ground change. Maybe that's meaningful. Yeah, it went from a Republican landslide to close elections. It raises the possibility that the apparent Democratic strength in Wisconsin and elsewhere is a mirage, an artifact of persistent and unaddressed biases in survey research. If the polls are wrong yet again, it would not be hard to explain. Most pollsters haven't made significant methodological changes since the last election. The major polling community post-mortem declared that it was, quote, impossible to definitively ascertain what went wrong in the 2020 election. Pattern of Democratic strength isn't the only sign that the polls might still be off. This Supreme Court Dobbs decision on abortion, some pollsters have said they're seeing the familiar signs of non-response bias. When people who don't respond to a poll are meaningfully different from those who participate, creeping back into their surveys. Brian Stryker, partner at Impact Research, Mr. Bryant is a client, told me that his polling firm was getting a ton of Democratic responses in recent surveys, especially in the familiar places where the polls have erred in recent cycles. None of this means the polls are destined to be as wrong as they were in 2020. Some of the polling challenges in 2020 might have since subsided, such as the greater likelihood that liberals were at home and thus more likely to take polls during the pandemic. Historically, it has been hard to anticipate polling errors simply by looking at the error from the previous cycle. For example, the polls in 2018 weren't so bad. Some pollsters are making efforts to deal with the challenge. Mr. Stryker said his firm was restricting the number of Democratic primary voters, early voters, and other super engaged Democrats in their surveys. Well, now you're just, what? I mean, now you're just, what's the methodological justification for that? That's just biasing it the other way. I think polls can not only tell you the momentum in the electorate, but you can't really rely on to predict outcomes. Jesus Christ. Was Palin projected to win Alaska? I think so, yeah. Have you spoken about Crystal Matthews, the racist Democrat who was recently exposed for her racism? Can't say that I know what that story is, to be honest. The pattern is worth taking seriously after what happened 2 years ago. With that in mind, here's an update on the table for 2020. The polling averages in 9 states the political reports describes as competitive. If the polls are just as wrong as they were in 2020, the race for the Senate looks very different. Senate polling averages in competitive states. All right. Colorado was pretty accurately polled, which makes sense to me. That makes sense to me. So John Fetterman was up by 5 if the polls are correct, if they're similar to 2020. Arizona, this is not Kirsten Sinema, it's Mark Kelly. Now this is the heartbreaking one. Feels bad, man. Mandela Barnes feels bad, man. I really want Mandela Barnes to win. The apparent Democratic edge in Senate races in Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio would evaporate. To take the chamber, Republicans would need any 2 of Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, or Pennsylvania. With Democrats today well ahead of Pennsylvania and Arizona, the fight for control of the chamber would come down to very close races in Nevada and Georgia. Regardless of who was favored, the race for Senate control would be extremely competitive. Republican control of the House would seem to be a foregone conclusion. Wow. Wow. That's fucking terrible, dude. That's fucking terrible, dude. Ah, fuck me, man. Are you watching the stream unsubbed? You're making income inequality worse. You are doing anti-praxis. We are the only Twitch stream that will not accept scam advertisers, and I will never fuck you over by selling you crap.